Leslie spoke, and it was really exciting. So before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say a couple things. I'm going to pass a handy-dandy sheet around. If you have signed it before, you don't need to sign it if you're already on the email list about events happening. If you want to just put your name so we know you've been here, that's great. If you want to get on the list, please put your name on it. So I'll start that now. Thank you. And also in the back of the room, there's a few flyers about Interfaith Peace Builder delegations to Israel and Palestine to meet with nonviolent and human rights activists there. And 3 of them coming up. 1 is in May. There's 2 more spots left, July and in October and November. So if you're interested, you can either come see me or you can go to the back and get a flyer. I'm really pleased to have Jeff Halper here again. He came about 1.5 years ago. He's been to Atlanta a few times. He's the founder and former director of Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions and has done a lot of work in rebuilding homes and resisting human rights violations in Palestine and towards the Palestinians in the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem and West Bank. And he's here now also with a project. He just published this new book, War Against the People, and as the coordinator of the People Yes Network. So he has not given this talk yet in Atlanta. I have run him around like a crazy maniac for the last few days in a lot of different places. So if you've seen him before here, he's going to talk about something else related to his book. So really happy to have you, and there you go.
Can we turn these lights down in the front? Is that possible? All right. Like Frank Sinatra. So it's good to be back here. I spoke at this church, as was mentioned, about 1.5 years ago, I guess. So I've been involved for many years, of course, in the Israel-Palestine conflict. For the last 18 years, as the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And I've spoken about that a few times here in Atlanta. And in fact, that conflict is ongoing, but I'm not going to talk about it tonight. I'm going to talk about what I call globalizing Palestine, because I think, you could ask the question, why is the Israel-Palestine conflict so prominent, among activists, or so prominent in the news even? Pro-Israeli advocates like Alan Dershowitz say it's because of anti-Semitism. That we ignore the Congo, we ignore what's happening in Mexico, we ignore Tibet, violence all over the world, and everybody focuses on Israel because everybody's anti-Semitic, basically. It's true that I think Israel-Palestine gets a disproportionate amount of attention. And I wish the Congo, among other conflicts, would get more. They certainly deserve more. But I think one reason why Israel-Palestine gets the attention it does is because it's a global conflict. It isn't simply a spat between 2 peoples in some faraway corner of the world, but it really disrupts the entire international system. Located as it is, of course, in one of the most volatile and yet important geopolitical parts of the world, with a lot of the world's energy resources, of course. The United States is fighting 5 wars or so in that part of the world. So obviously it has a tremendous impact on world politics, on security. I mean, you can't get on an airplane with a tube of toothpaste because of insecurities that go back to this part of the world and to this conflict. So it certainly is a conflict that deserves our attention. And in fact, Secretary of State Kerry said not long ago, and I agree with him on this, that the Israel-Palestine conflict isn't the source of all the conflicts in the Middle East that are spilling out to other parts of the world, including this part of the world. But you're not going to stabilize the wider Middle East. You're not going to be able to get control back. You're not going to bring security and development and stability to that part of the world or the whole world system unless you resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's this aggravating element all the time. It introduces militarism into the region. You know, last week, President Obama signed a bill giving $40 billion in new arms to Israel. Israel's a country the size of New Jersey. $40 billion of new arms, and that's over a 10-year period, from 2018 to 2028. And that's on top of $30 billion in new arms that Bush gave Israel in 2008. So here the United States alone is pouring $70 billion. Can you imagine what Georgia could do with $70 billion? You could fix a few bridges maybe. $70 billion in cutting-edge arms into one of the most volatile parts of the world. And that doesn't include sales to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to the Gulf states, Turkey, and of course all the American military involvement in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so on. So the Israel-Palestine conflict is this aggravating influence. Military, it polarizes peoples, of course, and actually one of the strategies of Israel is divide and conquer, to try to fragmentize the countries, to try to pit one people against another, whether it's within the Palestinians themselves that have been fragmented. So there's about 4 or 5 Palestinian people today, or in the wider Middle East. Plus, of course, all the the issue, which is a larger issue that I begin to get into, and that is that, in a way, the Israeli, I can even go back for a second, the Israeli domination of Palestine, and certainly of the occupied territories, is kind of a microcosm of the wider world system, in which the global north dominates the global south. And I think one reason why this has such a global impact is that the oppressed peoples of the world, including the peoples of Ferguson, look to the Palestinians as kind of an emblematic people. Here's someone called them a grain of sand, in this huge machine, defying one of the most powerful armies in the world, supplied by the most powerful army and country in the world, resisting neocolonialism, resisting occupation, resisting apartheid, and still keeping themselves alive. And I think for a lot of people in the world, if the Palestinians fall, and if in fact occupation wins, and if it's up to the American government in both parties, not to mention other countries, the occupation will win, setting human rights and international law that are the hope, the fragile little fingerhold that oppressed peoples have on some kind of a better life, setting it all back to square one. So there's a lot riding on this, and of course Israel is seen as the global north, which it allies itself to very openly, calls itself a European country, and of course it allies itself especially with the United States. Netanyahu speaks in Congress every few weeks. He's invited to speak against the policies of an American president in Congress at the invitation of both parties. And last time, a few months ago, when Netanyahu came to speak against the Iran deal, he spoke for 20 minutes and got 42 standing ovations. The Israeli press was laughing. They said the American Congress looked like the North Korean Parliament. So I think Americans don't realize, this is kind of another issue, but Well, I don't think Americans realize how isolated their country is becoming in the world. As it gets identified with a country not only oppressing the emblematic people of the global south, but that also defies human rights. And in fact, the United States comes out, if there's repeated UN votes, and it comes out the United States, Israel, and Micronesia against everybody else, I mean, that should send a pretty chilling message to Americans, but it certainly sends a chilling message to the rest of the world. So there's a lot riding on this conflict, and there's another aspect to it that I've written this book about, War Against the People. In fact, I wrote a book about something I know nothing about, which is interesting to do. And that is that, I mean, I don't know much about the military. I don't know much about security. It's not my field. I was never too interested in it. And I would suppose that most of us aren't that interested. One reason why I wrote it was because it's a blind spot on the left. We're just not aware of the technologies. We're not aware of its influence. You know, if you take the military, security, domestic security, homeland security, and policing together as one package, and I'll talk about that, that's become the reality, certainly after 9/11, is that these three aspects of violent control, military, homeland security, and policing, together they make up a $2.5 trillion a year industry. And I'm saying to myself, I'm on the left, I'm an activist, I'm trying to bring justice to the world, and I don't know anything about a $2.5 trillion industry. Whoa. I mean, how am I, you know, the impact on societies, on politics, on economics. I mean, some of the poorest countries in the world are the ones that buy the most arms. And I don't know anything about this industry, and obviously, within a capitalist system, the interests, the corporations that are involved, so security all of a sudden isn't some technical thing, but now we're talking about particular groups' interests in imposing certain kinds of security on us. But in addition to that, we know nothing about the technologies. I mean, I couldn't tell you a rifle from an F-16. I never was interested in it. I still don't. I don't call myself an expert by any means. But that's a problem. Because and this is what I begin to argue, I'll come back to it, as the world capitalist system, we're living in a world system we don't talk about very much. The only one today, I mean, we talk about capitalism, it sounds old-fashioned a little bit, or, you know, Stalinist or something. The only one who's a popular writer who talks about capitalism is Naomi Klein. The Shock Doctrine, her new book on climate change and capitalism, she talks about it, but most of us don't. And young people don't know much about a capitalist world system. And in fact, you know, there's that joke about two fish that meet. And one fish says, "How's the water?" And the other fish says, "What water?" You know, or "What's water?" In other words, we're living in this sea that influences every minute part of our lives, and we're not aware of it, and we don't think about it, we don't talk about it. We feel it, certainly with the Occupy movement, certainly oppressed peoples feel it. We talk about the 99%, 1%. Once in a while it surfaces, but we really don't know that much about the system. And the problem is that as that capitalist system goes more and more into crisis, it's unsustainable. You have climate change, resource wars are the new kinds of warfare, tremendous income disparities. 2/3 of humanity, we're in a church, we want a theological concept. 2/3 of humanity are classified by corporations as surplus humanity. Sometimes the word that's used is disposable humanity. People, 2/3 of humanity, will never be really educated, will never be productive in the sense that the capitalist system values production. They'll be cheap labor if they have any jobs. And the worst sin is they'll never be consumers. So as you begin to exclude more and more people, as there's more competition for scarce resources, and of course a lot of those resources exist underneath the poorest peoples of the world. There's a kind of I was coming to this afterwards, it's kind of a band around the equator, actually, not exclusively, of some of the world's most valuable resources. So, you know, remember that old bumper sticker that we used to have after the first Iraq War? How did our oil get under their sand? I mean, that's really the equation today. And as this whole system continues in this way, it has to become more repressive. It has to become more repressive. And the form of warfare that exists today is what generals call war amongst the people. War amongst the people. And so actually, as I was, you know, so this is something, we're the people. And it's not only the people of the global south, of course, but anyone who resists, anyone who finds themselves excluded. And as the Occupy movement showed, even our own young people in this country, I mean, middle-class young people, are more and more excluded from the system. They don't have job security anymore. They don't have unions to protect them very much in this neoliberal environment. And so there's nowhere in the world that's immune. So what's interesting is that when we think of war, we think of war. You know, armies fighting, battleships, nuclear missiles, at least in the background somewhere, jet fighters, you know, armies, navies, air forces battling. That's what and that's the type of war that the Pentagon is prepared for. The Pentagon is prepared for fighting the Soviet Union. Obviously, if you just look around, it's not prepared for fighting in Iraq. It's not prepared for Afghanistan. It's not prepared for Syria. It's not prepared for the Mexican drug cartels. It's prepared, you know, now you have the new stealth bomber. $1 trillion F-35. That's a completely useless airplane. As a matter of fact, when he was Secretary of Defense, Gates tried to cancel it. And he couldn't because it's been in the pipeline for 30 years, and every congressional district has a piece of it. You don't want to lose jobs. So the American military thinking is around, and European, is around conventional interstate wars. Especially since in Europe we're 70 years beyond the colonial era. Well, there really hasn't been an interstate war since World War II. You know, maybe Korea. There's been a couple episodic interstate wars. The Iran-Iraq War, the Falkland War, that was a cute little war that kept Thatcher in power. The 73 Israeli-Egyptian-Syrian War, and a few others. Ukraine, in a way, the little Georgia-Russia war, a few hours, actually. But in a global perspective, these interstate wars are very localized and very episodic. So that, what is war today? What is war today? Generals use the term war amongst the people as the new paradigm of warfare. Now, I changed that in my book to wars against the people, because because that's what it really is. I mean, the people don't happen just to be there. They're over resources, they're resisting, they're insurgents, they have a reason for fighting. But of course, the way it's phrased is that these people are insurgents, these people are in the way, these people are bad people, and so we fight wars amongst the people. And when the military uses that term, it's a technical term. Now we've got to develop tactics and weaponry and so on for those kinds of wars. And wars against the people, again, as I called them, take two major forms. One is what the military calls hybrid wars. More often, I mean, look at all the terms that are used. More often we talk about asymmetrical conflicts or counterinsurgency, but there's all kinds of variations of this. Hybrid wars are wars of states against non-state actors. The United States against ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or Mexican drug cartels, or mafias, or the war on, in other words, on non-state actors around the world. And one of the prominent forms of warfare that's really becoming the major form of warfare is what's called resource wars. Wars for oil, for water, for minerals, and for timber. These are the most valuable resources, again, found largely in the poorest parts of the world, but that are getting more and more scarce. The war in the Congo, which is indeed probably the worst conflict in the world, from the point of view of its scale, of the violence, is a resource war. It's simply gangs trying to control all kinds of, sometimes it's called, the play, what's that Japanese toy, not play school, PlayStation. It's called the PlayStation War, because there's a kind of a mineral that's only found in the Congo, the only place in the world that is necessary for cell phones and for PlayStations and those video games, those kinds of things. So you've got, so that those are resource wars, and they're a kind of, but there's other kinds, of course, of hybrid wars. We're fighting in the Middle East and so on. The other kind of war against the people is what's called securocratic wars. I call them securocratic wars. And these are wars within our society. Because the global south, as we well know, is as much inside the global north countries in terms of poor people and immigrants and so on, people in prison, as it is outside. So we fight securocratic wars, and we call them counterterrorism. Look at the language we use: war on crime, war on drugs. In other words, you take domestic issues and you put them within a war metaphor. Not to mention, of course, militarizing the police in a very conscious way. There's a program, the 1033 program of the Pentagon, to give surplus military equipment to American police forces. Homeland Security is a part of that. And here's where you get that coming together, because in Western societies, including the United States, it's always been crucial to keep a wall between the outside and the inside. The inside is our sovereignty. The inside is our intimate space. This is where our people live and so on. So you want to keep wars out there. So the military is out there. You don't use the army at home. At home you have police forces and security forces, but you don't use them abroad. Well, after 9/11 especially, that whole thing began to break down. And the concept of Homeland Security, that's one of the largest departments. It employs like 700,000 people, Homeland Security, exactly bridges, and it creates a very dangerous breach in that wall between the outside and the inside. And it gets into states of emergency. I mean, a states of emergency, it's where security trumps your democratic protections. You've been with the Patriot Act now. That's been, reaffirmed by Democrats. You've been in a state of emergency since 9/11. And in many ways, your civil liberties, if not endangered, certainly give the police and the security agencies powers to intervene in your lives in ways they never could have before. And again, it's not just technical security. The Patriot Act was enacted like a week after 9/11. You can't tell me all the members of Congress burned the midnight oil and sat all week to think it up. It was there. It was in the drawer. It's what they wanted to do, the powers that be, and they found the trigger for it. You have the same thing in France now, with the attacks on Paris. France is in a state of emergency, giving the police and security powers that no one ever thought they would have in France. Now, it's supposed to be for 3 months. States of emergency don't go away. So let's see. We're almost at the end of the 3 months since the Paris attacks. Let's see if, in fact, they rescind it. Israel has been in a state of emergency since 1945. When it wants to prosecute and persecute Palestinians, hold them for years with no charge, with no trials and so on, and do all the other draconian things they do, like house demolitions and so on. It's the 1945 British emergency regulations that trump any kind of democratic or human rights the Palestinians might have. So this is really a very dangerous part of securocratic wars. Now you've got this interesting case of Apple versus the FBI. I'll bet you that most people come down on the side of the FBI, like Trump has, among others. Because security trumps, double entendre, democratic protections, down to policing and discipline. The United States is the largest capitalist country and the richest capitalist country in the world. You have 4% of the world's population. You use about 40% of the world's resources every year, just the United States. And you have 25% of the world's prisoners. Whoa, how does that come together? How do you have a rich, free democracy that happens to have more prisoners than any other country in the world? Not to mention more death sentences than almost any other country. You see, all this, has a context and a logic that we have to begin to, I think the left has to begin to understand more. I mean, I certainly learned a lot writing this book, and I think it's important. So part of the battle space is securocratic war. You have the militarization of the police, but you also have the policification of the military. Militaries aren't fighting wars. These days they're regime change, they're doing nation building, peacekeeping, all kinds of things that really have to do with policing and disciplining. And the language of the military is changing. They don't talk anymore about battlefields. The battlefield is an old term from the conventional wars, when you had a discrete area and you had a battle. Now they talk about battle space. And Atlanta is as much a part of battle space as Iraq. And they talk, if you notice, even Obama, notice this, you don't talk much about soldiers anymore. You talk about warriors. I was just on the airplane and they applauded the warriors, the wounded warriors. Warriors is this term that encompasses soldiers and police. See, so all these terms begin to create one very dangerous, I think, kind of a kind of an equation. And, okay. So one of the questions I was asking, when all these years I've been an activist, fighting house demolitions, fighting the occupation, and so on, but in the back of my mind was a question that always nagged me. How does Israel get away with this? I mean, here we are, again, 60, 70 years after the colonial era. So colonizing global South peoples isn't the fashion anymore. Concepts like human rights and international law have percolated into the minds of people. This has happened. This is probably the most documented war in history, or conflict in history. I mean, there's thousands of books and films, and it's on TV every day, in the glare of the cameras, in the Holy Land, no less. So churches have got to notice that this is happening in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And of course, Israel presents itself as a European country, and is very much welcomed as a European country. Israel is not only a strategic ally of the United States, and very involved with Europe, all kinds of stuff in Europe, military and so on, but it's a part of NATO. It's not a member of NATO, but NATO does exercises with Israel and so on. And Israel was just accepted a couple of years ago into the OECD, which is the exclusive club of the world's most advanced economies. So 25 of the richest, most democratic countries in the world, because it has to be unanimous when you're accepted. All 25 countries voted to accept Israel into their club. So that the question is, even if there's beginning to be some cracks among the people, how does Israel get away with this? The usual explanations didn't do it for me on a global scale. AIPAC, the Israeli lobby. Well, AIPAC has clout, certainly, in the United States. I don't think it runs the United States, but it has clout. But it doesn't explain India. It's become super pro-Israel. India was always very strongly pro-Palestinian. There weren't diplomatic relations between India and Israel until the 1990s. And yet today, it's a super supporter of Israel. Guilt over the Holocaust. Well, that might work in Germany, where it does work. Germany has what it calls a special relationship with Israel. It doesn't work in China or in Brazil. I don't think it works in the United States. I don't think most Americans even know there was a Holocaust. Christian fundamentalism. Christian Zionism. Again, that has a certain influence in the U.S., in the Republican Party. You can hear it in the debates and so on. Here and there in a few other places. When Stephen Harper was the last Prime Minister of Canada, he was an avowed Christian Zionist. In Holland, you have some strong Christian Zionists, but they certainly don't have a huge impact in other parts of the world. So all those explanations we usually put forth don't do it on a global scale. So I was looking for the elephant in the room. I was always reminded by Kissinger saying, countries don't have friends, they have interests. So what is the interest here? What's the big reason why Israel is getting the support it gets almost globally from governments? And I began, instead of looking down at what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, I started to look up at Israel's role in the world. What is it delivering to the elites of the world, the governments of the world, that can account for the support it gets? And what became obvious was its military, security, and policing exports. That in fact, Israel is exporting the occupation. And if you put it within this framework, you see, if you say, well, the United States and most of the countries of the global north don't have arsenals appropriate to forms of warfare that don't exist anymore. And this becomes wars against the people, both kinds. This becomes an Israeli niche. Not exclusively, of course. I don't want to say Israel is the only actor by any means. But this becomes an Israeli niche because Israel has been engaged in a war against the people, against the Palestinian people, for 100 years. So it has the tactics, the weaponry, the security systems, the surveillance systems, the models of control, what I call the matrix of control, that's exportable to the elites. And when you look at the map, you begin to see how it works. You know, the United States, I make a claim, it might be crazy, but there's something to it that's useful. Israel has more global reach in terms of this military security policing stuff than the United States does. You say, well, how could that be? The Pentagon's budget is $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion of your money goes to the Pentagon every year. The United States has bases in 174 countries out of 193. So you have quite a bit of global reach, but it's kind of a shallow presence. You have military bases, but they're bases you take off from usually for exercises or operations in other places. You know, for the most part, the soldiers, the sailors, whatever, are confined to base when they're in a country, and then they go out and they do whatever they do and they come back. Israel, we know, has military relations with 130 countries. That's been documented. I'm sure that it's as many as the United States, but we've documented 130. It doesn't have bases. In fact, Israel only has 2 bases, and what's interesting is they're both in Muslim countries. One is in Eritrea, off Eritrea, some islands here, and the other one is in Azerbaijan, which is very crucial because that's the country that borders to the north of Iran. So if you want a good jumping off place, it's Azerbaijan. And in fact, this begins to get in to what I call security politics. And that is when you put the military and policing and security and all the money involved and all the power and technologies of control involved, it bypasses ideologies. And all of a sudden, everybody wants it. I mean, I don't care what my ideology is, whether I'm pro-Israel, anti-Israel, if I'm an Islamic fundamentalist, if I'm a Christian Zionist, if I'm Chinese, Indian, a Hindu nationalist, doesn't matter what I am, a Mexican warlord, it doesn't matter. I want the technologies and the arms that will help me stay in control. And Israel is the go-to place. Not, again, not the only place, I'm not saying that, but certainly a key. I mean, Israel is the 5th, 6th, 7th largest arms exporter in the world. Israel is basically tied with France. So it has a very, very prominent position among the powers that be. Nobody's going to catch up to the United States. You guys win hands down. 70% of the new arms poured into the world every year come from the United States. But Israel is high on the list of the next ones. So, and it's even more important that I'll talk to you and I'll talk about it in a second. So here's the quid pro quo. Israel is very strong in the global north. I mean, it's a strategic ally of the United States. It gets $4 or more billion a year in cutting-edge weaponry. But more important, it has access, privileged access to American military technology. And this is the basis of its ability to develop arms that it sells all over the world. I mean, that's a crucial, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but that's certainly a crucial element of all of this. The privileged access, because part of Israel's economy is high tech. It's one of the world's centers for high tech. And high tech is military. It's basically military. The byproducts that we have are byproducts. They're not the main thrust of military technologies. Plus the United States, I mean, there's a lot of things I can say. I'm not going to get into too much detail. But the United States has, for 30 years now, a policy that's called giving Israel a qualitative military edge. The QME, it's called. And that is, I mean, there's a lot of arms being poured into this area of the world. The United States has created its own internal arms race. So it gives $3 billion in arms to Egypt, which is not one of the friendliest dictatorships in the world. Saudi Arabia, which is hardly a paragon of human rights, bought about $7 billion in new arms last year from the United States. The Gulf states have their billions. Turkey, that's also a part of NATO and so on. Of all the billions that go in here, into this part of the world, the United States guarantees Israel a qualitative military edge over all the countries of the Middle East combined. So if the United States sells all this equipment to Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Gulf states and everybody, it has to up it for Israel. So it's in its own arms race. Because how do you keep little Israel more powerful and more advanced militarily than all the others? So it's a closed circuit kind of a thing. And of course it's a huge subsidy to the American defense industry. It's a fake economy. It isn't real, but it has obviously, and Stephen Zunas, who's a political scientist in California, writes, we talk about AIPAC all the time, but in fact the American defense firms, Boeing and Lockheed and Northrop Grumman and a million other ones, are much more active and effective lobbyists for Israel than AIPAC is. I think Boeing has a budget 7 times larger than AIPAC. And they have a huge interest, both in general in the Middle East, but also in the qualitative military edge aspect of it. Also, Israel, like I said, is very strong in Europe. For example, it's developing the new European drone, which is called the Watchkeeper drone. And the EU has a plan of giving money, research and development money, especially for military things. It's called Horizon 2020 is the new cycle. And Israel gets more money from the EU than any other non-European country, largely for military research and development. It's very, okay. But there's another interesting part of world politics. There's a second tier of countries that are called the emerging economies that are rising and challenging Euro-American hegemony. They're called, some of them, the BRICS countries. You know that term. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And they know that they're an up-and-coming bloc. They have a summit meeting every few years. So, they realize their economic potential. Now they've been joined by another bloc called the Mint countries, which is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. You take these countries together and they comprise a major rival to the United States, who's especially concerned, of course, about China. The United States is moving the entire Sixth Fleet into the South Pacific to sort of contain China. And yet Israel is strong and very entrenched in every single one of those BRICS Mint countries. So here we have, for example, and here's security politics at work. Israel is the loyal ally of the United States. We love the United States. We share moral values with you. Netanyahu comes and gets applauded in Congress. All of a sudden you look at the map and you see Israel is the number 2 arms supplier to China. Whoa. It's the number 2 arms supplier to the main rival of the United States. And a lot of its arms, it's not arms, it's high-tech components for weapon systems mainly. So first of all, it shows how American military technology is being transferred to China through Israel. But also, if you can be number 2 to China after Russia, if you can be number 2 to China, but you're not selling battleships and jet airplanes and expensive platforms, but you're selling high-tech components. To be number 2 to China and sell that shows you the degree to which you've got to be penetrating deeply, deeply into the Chinese military and security. And here there's a whole Cold War beginning to develop with Putin in Russia. And here Russia and Israel are the 2 major arms suppliers to China. Not to mention India. Israel, depending on the year, is the 2nd, 3rd, 4th largest arms supplier to India. So here it's supplying arms to 2 of the largest militaries in the world that are challenging Euro-American hegemony. Not to mention, I won't go into them all, Nigeria, Brazil, and so on. So you've got that. But then there's a 3rd tier to the world. And that's what's called the Global South. The poor countries. We used to call it the 3rd world countries. And here again, Israel is super strong. In countries you've never heard of. Equatorial Guinea. Some of the worst, which has been called the worst country in Africa in terms of its dictatorship. And the presidential guard and a lot of the security are trained by Israel. You have many Israeli business people in the Congo that control the minerals of the Congo, a lot of them. A lot of them are Russian Israeli mafia types, Angola, and so on. So what I'm saying is the United States has a global spread in terms of military bases, but Israel has a global spread not only in the military realm throughout the globe, but deeper. It trains your security forces, your special operations forces, your presidential guard, and your police forces. So here we are, I'll mention in a minute, here we are in Atlanta with the Gilly Center down the street. Georgia State University has an Israeli-sponsored, an Israeli-run law enforcement exchange program. We'll talk about it in a minute. So what is that all about? Israel is training the LAPD. Israel has restructured the Washington, D.C. police force so that this is not only going into countries that need some kind of aid, but this conception of policing that's based on war against the people, in which the people are terrorists and not citizens, is beginning to penetrate very strongly into the U.S. And this is part of that whole securocratic war complex. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but one reason why I wrote the book was because I wanted also for us to know the technologies. I mean, I'm using Israel, I'm kind of picking on Israel, it's a good country to pick on, but I'm using Israel as a vehicle for exposing the way this whole system works, this security system that's controlling our lives, the globalizing Palestine, I call it, because Israel's a small country, and it can't produce F-35s and battleships and things like that. So if I would look at the U.S., I mean, the U.S. builds huge, expensive systems. Whether they work or not, nobody cares, and it imposes them on the world. You don't learn very much from that. It's like a bull in a china shop. Israel's a small country that has limited capabilities, so it has to scramble. And the Israeli Ministry of Defense, officially, its strategy explicitly is called niche filling. So it looks around the world at elites, whether it's global north governments or global south governments, or warlords. And it says, what do these elites need to stay in power in an increasingly restive world? And it fills those niches, you see, and that's where it becomes much more interesting for us to look at, because that reveals all the nooks and crannies of this whole system better than, trying to trace what the United States is doing. And there's 4 niches that Israel has developed. It provides, again, high-tech weaponry and components for conventional militaries. It develops weapons of hybrid warfare and securocratic control, what I call weapons of suppression against the people. And this is where policing and security comes in. It offers a model of securitization, a matrix of control that it developed in the occupied territories and exports outward. Framing is very important. How do you sell this? Because this is a war against the people. We're the people. How do we buy into it? Well, Israel is very good at doing that as well. So I'll just mention quickly one. I want to talk about niche 2, and the other things I'll leave aside for the moment. Israel does play a role in conventional interstate warfare and weaponry. So, thanks, I know when Elise is approaching me, she's either telling me time is up, or here's the glass of water. So Israel is the 4th largest nuclear power in the world. I mean, it sells itself as this little Jewish boy in a tough neighborhood of bullies. But in fact, Israel has, we'll never catch up to you guys. The United States has like 10,000 nuclear warheads. Israel is tied with France. It has 200 to 300 nuclear warheads, but it has multiple ways of delivering them. So, all right, sitting in Atlanta, maybe it's not such a big deal, but when I give this talk in London, I say to people, Israel has 200 or 300 nuclear missiles, and it has its own intercontinental ballistic missile system that it makes itself, called the Jericho series. And it has other smaller missile systems that are nuclear capable as well. And it turns out that London is within the range of Israeli nuclear missiles. Everybody's concerned about Iran. That has no nuclear missiles. And even if they did, they have no way to deliver them. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, but it doesn't have a delivery capability. It's a very complex system, this nuclear thing, and Israel is very sophisticated. So, that's kind of, okay, interesting, until we think that, Israel is not the most stable state of the world. And it has, Seymour Hersh wrote a book called The Samson Option, in which he says, and it's true, Israel has a policy that's called nuclear ambiguity. The Samson Option says, if we go down, we're not going down alone. It's like the ultimate extortion to the international community. You can only push us so. One explanation that you could certainly give of how Israel gets away with this is fear of its nuclear, how it would react if it was pressed. For example, I'll give you a concrete example. Israel says, if we're existentially threatened, we'll use our nuclear missiles in ways that we're not going to tell you. So, we could conceivably shoot at London, shoot at Europe, or whatever. Well, you have the two-state solution idea. The Jordan Valley is a part of the two-state solution. Israel considers the Jordan Valley its security border. And its present Minister of Defense, Moshe Ya'alon, has said, if we are pressed to give up the Jordan Valley, we will consider that an existential threat. And then he tapers off. So it could very well be that Israel could construe international pressures that go too far to really make it give up the occupation as an existential threat, and that could trigger a nuclear attack. So these things, I mean, they're not so crazy in a sense. There are scenarios that you can think of that these would come about. Israel does make, it's very sophisticated and high tech. It does make a jet fighter. It doesn't make it, it still makes it, it sells it to third world countries called the Kfir. There was a huge fight in Israel. The United States finally made Israel give up the Kfir because it was competing, it was using American military technology too much. So now Israel just simply gets American jet fighters. Israel is taking possession of a squadron of F-35s before the American Air Force does. Because who would you rather have test F-35s? Israel in real time or American pilots in Texas? So, but they have that capability. Israel also has a whole series of nuclear-capable missiles that are, shorter range, obviously, than intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Gabriel series, for example. And if you look on Israeli websites, how they market these weapons, look, they're all combat-proven. Combat-proven. Well, who are they combat-proven on? And this gets into another aspect, of course, and that is, why, you could ask the question, why didn't Israel give up the occupied territories 30 years ago when the Palestinians accepted the two-state solution, and for the price of 22% of the west of the country, Jericho and Tulkarm and Gaza, they could have had peace, security, acceptance by the entire Arab world and the international community, and 78% of the country. Whoa, what's going on here? And I would suggest that rather than a burden, and even rather than a religious site, Israel sees the occupied territory as a laboratory, where it tests and develops new weapon systems, security systems, and tactics. Certainly you see it in the websites. People ask me, how did I collect this material? It must be all secret. No. Why would you develop great weapon systems for sale and keep them hidden? I mean, look, somebody said kiddingly, and I always have to watch myself. Somebody said, you know what? If I just walked in here from the street, I would think this is a presentation given by the Israeli Chamber of Commerce. It's great. We've got effective weapon systems, we deal with security, we're helping American police forces, we're making a lot of money, we'll help your company make money. Where do I sign? That sounds great. So I'm assuming, of course, that we've contextualized this. But for Israeli defense firms, this is good what they're doing. They're not ashamed of it. They're advertising it in their websites. There's 500 Israeli companies that export arms and security. And they're all proud of it, and they're marketing it. So most people aren't in our mindset. For most people, this is a good thing, and it's good that Israel is our ally, and you know the way that goes. So that the occupied territory becomes a very important resource. Because if you don't have that laboratory, how do you keep the market edge? I would say without the occupied territory, Israel would be New Zealand. It'd be a little country, it'd be nice to visit, which isn't such a bad thing, except it's not how Israel sees itself, you see? So that you can't explain, for example, the disproportionate attack on Gaza last summer in 2014 by the actual military threat that these Qassam rockets of Hamas posed. I mean, you can't explain it in military terms. The massive use of conventional weapons, and the Army and the Air Force and the Navy and drones and artillery and laser-guided missiles only means that this was an exercise in testing weapons that are then for sale. For example, and I have in my book in the back a list of weapons that were used for the first time in Gaza, including the new Israeli 900 drone that was taken off the production line. It wasn't even tested yet and was sent in Gaza in 2014. So this is really important, the fact that we have a laboratory and our weaponry is combat proven, and that certainly gives us an edge. Talk about nuclear and military sophistication. Israel, a country the size of New Jersey, I repeat, is taking delivery of 9 nuclear-capable submarines from Germany. Israel couldn't possibly build this, so Germany is building it. Some of them are for sale at bargain rates, and some of them are being given to Israel. This is the guilt over the Holocaust at work. But the shell is German. But everything that fills it up, electronic systems, the avionics, the radar systems, the targeting systems, the missiles, it's all Israeli. So you can imagine what 9 submarines like this mean in terms of a laboratory, an opportunity to fill it up with your electronics. And then, of course, the byproducts of all of that is high tech and so on. But this is a super sophisticated platform for Israeli electronic technologies that a country like Israel would never have an opportunity to develop if it was a normal small country. Israel also produces a tank. But in particular, high-tech components for weapon systems like this targeting pod that's used by every air force in the world. And not to mention cyber warfare, which is something we don't know much about, tremendously destructive form of warfare that could really kill, it could kill many more people instantly than nuclear war, because it shuts down entire countries. And it's been used by the United States and Israel against Iran. But what I want to focus on, in just a few minutes, I promise I'm not going to go on and on all night, although I could, are what are called weapons of repression or weapons of suppression. And these are arms that are actually used on people. I mean, unlike nuclear weapons and submarines and so on, these are really weapons used in wars against the people. Well, then why do we start in outer space? That seems pretty distant. Well, Israel is one of 7 countries in the world that has the capability of launching satellites, using its own rockets, its own satellites and its own rockets, plus satellites for other countries. It launches, for example, the satellites of India. And especially, it launches spy satellites. That's what's called dual use, the dual military-civilian use. Spy satellites that are also communication satellites and also surveillance satellites. One of the series is called the OFIC series, and your Facebook, so this is getting personal now, your Facebook just invested $100 million in an Israeli military company to give them access to OFIC 10, which is a satellite Israel is going to launch soon, that will give Facebook access to Africa that it doesn't have today. So the connections between our lives and spy satellites and technologies become very explicit. This is a whole thing I'm not going to get into, but amazing. Nanotechnology. which has a benign image, for most of it. We think of nanotechnology, we think of biomedicine. But Israel is the world's leader in the military applications of nanotechnology. A nano is a billionth of a meter. It's the size of a molecule. And it works in swarms. I mean, you have trillions of, as a matter of fact, one, it's called a nano warrior. They're made of carbon, so they self-replicate. So one nano warrior can replicate 1 trillion times within 3 weeks. So nano warriors can be equipped with enhanced artificial intelligence. So you can create a nano warrior that's smarter than we are, and then you can weaponize it. You can give it the capability to kill. For example, one form it takes is what's called nanovirus weapons. I mean, they're you can just spread them like dust. They're even smaller than dust over an entire population. They're invisible. And they can target DNA of a population. They're like the ultimate biological warfare weapons. They could target the nervous system of an entire population. They could target parts of your brain. They can make an entire population forget, for example. So these are weapons. I mean, how are we going to start controlling these kinds of nano weapons? And there's a form that's being developed. It's not clear if they've been deployed yet. Probably not, but there's one form that's called smart dust. And that is that it's like dust. You want to find somebody in Atlanta or Gaza. You can simply dust an area, but the dust are the nanoparticles are in fact sensors. So you can program someone's DNA or a group's DNA into these sensors, and it'll pick them out, wherever. There's no more hiding. There's no more anonymous spaces. Drones are weapons of repression. These are weapons specifically used to hunt people. Now, Israel produces 40% of the world's drones. The United States is a latecomer. And even your Predator drone and Reaper drone is basically an Israeli drone that's been souped up, and as the European drone is. This is very interesting because it shows how weapons reflect your concept of war. Drone technology began in the 1970s. So why didn't the United States jump in and grab this technology and run with it? Because it was considered in the conventional concept of war, it was considered a stupid weapon. Because what does a drone do? It hangs in the sky. So it can be shot down easily by an airplane, by artillery. It's a stupid weapon in a war. So the Americans weren't interested. But Israel was already fighting war amongst the people. And the people don't have air forces and artillery. They're fighting the Palestinians, they're fighting Hezbollah, fighting Egypt in the war of attrition after the 6-Day War when they didn't have capabilities yet. And this is the kind of cutting-edge war, I'm saying, that we're moving into very strongly today. So for Israel, drones were perfect. You can't shoot them down, and they do what humans can't do, the drudgery. They hang there. They loiter, that's the official word, for days and weeks and months. I mean, a human couldn't do it for 8 hours. And they hang, and they survey, and they map, and they track movements, and when the time comes, they can kill. Not very accurately. It was just a report out about a month or two ago that 90% of the fatalities of drone attacks are civilians. They only hit 10% of who they're supposed to hit, but they're highly sophisticated, and they just don't give a shit. They're highly sophisticated, and so the fact that Israel developed them showed that it was a kind of an appropriate weapon for wars amongst the people that only later the United States got into. You see, it really shows how your concept of war affects what kind of weapons you develop. And there's all kinds of, Israel's pioneering this as well, with other countries, autonomous weapons. You talk about ethics. You were in a Christian church concerned about ethics. We're all concerned about ethics. Here's where computers make the decision of who to kill and when to kill them. It's not a remote control. You have that as well, of course, where soldiers sit in this country, they sit in Las Vegas and they hunt people in Afghanistan. Here, you don't even have that. You simply program certain parameters and algorithms into a computer program, and the computer decides who to shoot and when to shoot and how to shoot. I won't get into a kind of an urban warfare tank. D9 bulldozers that are designed to demolish Palestinian homes are certainly weapons of suppression. Made by the United States, made by Caterpillar, that's a target of BDS, but the shovel is designed by Israel, the Israeli army, because if a normal bulldozer hits a building, the building would collapse on the driver. It's not made for that. So you make the shovel in a way that when it hits a building, the building falls away from the driver. It's a powerful machine made explicitly to demolish homes. And look, there's a kind of a hook in the back, a hydraulic hook. What is that? Again, for war against the people. You take that hook, these are powerful machines, they're like two-story machines. You plunge the hook into the pavement of a city. In Gaza, it's been used in 2002 in Operation Defensive Shield. It was used in all the Palestinian cities of the West Bank. You shove it into the pavement and you drive this bulldozer up and down the streets of a city, and it rips out all the infrastructure. The sewage lines, the electrical lines, the television, the telephone lines, everything is ripped out. It's a city destroying bulldozer. And small things as well. One of the BDS targets I would suggest is the Technion, which is Israel's largest polytechnic university, which is also its largest laboratory, the IDF's largest laboratory, that makes micro drones. You see, drones aren't just big things. Now imagine this floating around, fluttering around, invading your privacy. These become police and security type weapons. Look at how small a drone can be. And this is the head here, this is poison, and these are cameras. And it gets to a point where even we're starting to weaponize insects themselves. You turn insects into weapons. That's what this miniaturization is able to do. And I'm going to end on this in a minute. About war, what I'm saying here is, in war amongst the people, the security policing part, actually the most important part of war is the policing side, not the military side. We all see the military. They use big weapons, they attack, it's dramatic, there's a lot of death. But the other side of that, the securocratic war, is what's called the everyday war. It's invisible. There's, if war is against the people, if war is a kind of policing is a kind of war. Certainly a kind of class war within this neoliberal capitalist system that's starting to close down. And so it's actually the weapons we don't see, that are not sexy, that are not interesting, that are just part of the everyday hardware of our back, that are the ones that kill. Small arms of police and security agencies and people kill infinitely more people than the nuclear missiles or F-16s or battleships. just to show you, there's 875 million small arms, up to 1 billion, that are distributed globally. 650 million of them, 75% are in civilian hands. And it's interesting that the US accounts for 270 million of the 600, almost 50% of those arms are in the hands of American civilians. Almost 200 million are controlled by armed forces. So look, the armed forces have 200 million weapons, and civilians in the US alone have 270 million weapons. Only about 26 million are in law enforcement hands. Gang members have between 2 and 10 million around the world, and look, the non-state armed actors that we're talking about, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these kinds of non-state actors, the Taliban and so on, only have 1.4 million weapons. So when you really look at the balance of things, it's the civilian side and the policing side that is much more armed and shoots much more and kills much more than what we see as our military enemies. So that, and of course, most of the victims of securocratic violence are women and children. And Israel, of course, contributes to that. These are all arms that are both military and police arms. As a matter of fact, American police forces have started to adopt these weapons. This is a Tavor assault rifle made by the Israel weapons industry. A light machine gun, that's super. You see, Israel makes them super versatile for every kind of environment. The Uzi, I have to say more about the Uzi. It's the most popular submachine gun in the world. It's used commonly by American police forces. And this is a gun that's being used more and more by American police. It's Israel weapons industry, the X-95, it's both an assault rifle and a carbine rifle and a submachine gun. And it's made specifically for police forces. Israel produces a kind of a weapon that's called corner shot for SWAT teams, where policemen can shoot around corners so they don't have to expose themselves. Of course, a huge industry that we don't take into account is what's called non-lethal weapons. In fact, the term that's used more and more is near-lethal weapons, or less lethal weapons, because in fact they do kill. Things like tear gas and other chemical agents. Israel develops, and this is used now in the United States as well, a spray that's called skunk. It's like spraying you with sewage and shit and skunk smell and rotten stuff. I mean, it's almost unbearable. And they shoot them, you can see here, this is Bethlehem. Shooting at homes of people in Bethlehem. There was one wedding party that was sprayed with this stuff in Bethlehem, and it doesn't go away for a week. You can shower and wash and scrub, whether it's your clothes or yourself, for a week, and you can't get rid of the smell. And then, the reason I show this, Israel produces riot control vehicles. Well, I mean, now we're starting to yawn. It's getting towards the end of the lecture, it's late, and this stuff isn't interesting. But what I'm saying is that's exactly the inverse relationship. The weapons that are the most boring, and the most common, and even the most simple. I mean, you can put this riot control equipment that shoots skunk, or tear gas, or has all kinds of mechanisms to it, onto a Chevy chassis. That's not going to get me out to a demonstration. But these are the machines that really control the people. These are the machines of securocratic war, which is much more basic to our lives than what we usually think of as war. Israel is one of the world's leaders in perimeter security. All kinds of fences, electronic fences and sensors and so on, So for example, Israel's making a fortune today in southeastern Europe because it's selling these kinds of fences to European countries against the refugees that are trying to come in. And I'll show you how security politics works. The EU, the foreign ministers of the entire EU, about 3 weeks ago, announced that European companies were not allowed to do business with Israeli settlements. Well, an EU decision has to be unanimous. And there was one country that held out for Israel. That was Greece. Our Greece, the hero that's fighting neoliberal Merkel with a left government. I mean, they really have a left government, not some liberal government. Tsipras from Greece was in Israel, where he declared Jerusalem to be the eternal capital of the Jews. And, you know, is buying a lot of the security equipment to keep out refugees. Not to mention perimeter control of the huge natural gas resources that have been discovered between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. So these kinds of things are invisible, but these are the ways in which we're controlled. And surveillance systems. You know, if you have 600 checkpoints in the West Bank, it's no accident that Israel is the world's leader in biometrics and in digital surveillance systems. And in a surveillance, and they're selling these to cities all over the world. Again, security seems to be a neutral thing, so we all want to be secure. But what's interesting is we're talking now about the rise of security states to replace democracies. In this kind of capitalist system, you're beginning to move to security states, and people want security. They'll support the FBI over Apple any day. And what is a security state? What's the greatest threat? I took this off the website of NICE Systems, which is one of the largest Israeli corporations that sells this all over the world. One of the threats to a security state is what are called spaces of anonymity. If a state doesn't know where you are and who you're talking to and what you're saying, it gets very nervous. So these are totalizing types of systems in which through CCTV cameras and other monitors that are digitalized, so they don't have to go through hours and hours of films. A data bank is being built for all of you, for all of us. And it has to do with biometrics, face recognition, voice recognition, body recognition if you happen to limp, or you carry yourself in a certain way, or you have a twitch, or whatever quirk you have, it picks it up and it's in the data bank. So you can be picked up. This is this issue of crime prevention. You can be picked up on the suspicion of your behavior patterns indicate that you will commit a crime, according to an algorithm. Now you get into that algorithm, you try to get out. It becomes Kafka mixed with Tom Cruise, and it's a very scary thing. And to round this off, here we are in Georgia. The Gilley Center at GSU brings police officers from the United States to Israel for training. Here, the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange. These are the names of the people that just went this last, I think, this year. I don't know where you're all from, but you've got your Atlanta Deputy Police Chief went. I don't know all these communities, but there's a good chance that your police officers are going for training in Israel. And I'll leave it there. I'll let Frank Zappa have the last word.